Thank you so much. Clingen is a landscape architect. Welcome this morning. Her work focuses on communicating climate change impacts and adaptation strategies, including the way that sea level rise and storm surge will reshape coastal access, presumably in the future, but perhaps also in the present. Born and raised on the Gulf of Maine in the United States, she is currently a PhD candidate in architecture at the University of Cambridge and a research affiliate at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design's Office for Urbanization. Welcome, Kira. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you to Nicholas and everyone else for organizing the symposium today. I'm really honored to be going right after Mike because I think the work that I'm going to share has some similarities both to what he presented and then also the kind of issues that Nicholas outlined in the introduction as well. And so, as Hannah just said, I am a landscape architect and a design researcher. And so, my work today is a little bit closer to designing the types of green infrastructure solutions that could be kind of a different solution to the Cape de Roche project that Mike presented. And my PhD work and what I work on today is really focused on flood risk communication. But I'm actually going to share some kind of older work that I completed in 2021 with four other researchers who can't join us today, but I want to just be sure to mention their names because this was a group kind of collaborative effort between myself, Keoni Rodriguez, Mercy Adhiambo, Vanessa Cordova, and Saad as part of a fellowship run by Planet Reimagined, which is a nonprofit organization that uses applied action research to work on climate issues. And so, again, this is work that we completed in 2021 in a white paper, which I'll share in the chat after I finish presenting. And the title of this paper was Toward a Global Framework for Coastal Public Access. And I'd love to end with a call for how we might push this work forward, which is something I'd love to continue collaborating on with the folks who are joining today. And the images that I'm sharing in the presentation are part of what we produced as a series of advocacy materials that were shared on social media at the conclusion of the fellowship, which was an attempt to make the somewhat more formal research that I'll share accessible to a broader public, especially to youth living along the coast in different countries. And I think that this was important because as a research team, the four of us are coming from very different, both academic and geographic locations. Mercy is from Kenya, Rai from Pakistan, Keoni from Hawaii, and Vanessa and I from the East Coast of the United States. And so one of the things that we all shared in common was living in a country with a coastline. And one of the first kind of immediate things that we discussed or talked about was, despite all bordering the ocean, our access and kind of experiences and lived experiences on the coast all varied based on the legal frameworks or regulations in each of the countries that we were living in. And so we chose to use this shared common ground as a lens to understand the ocean as a global commons that connected us during, again, this was done in 2021, so during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to explicitly study coastal public access in low elevation coastal zones. These coastal zones are areas along the coast that are defined as being 10 meters or lower, and they're also being developed more rapidly than almost anywhere else on the planet, despite being some of the most vulnerable places on the planet. These coastlines are constantly being made and remade by the ocean, including tides, storms, and sea level rise. And they're also highly variable, especially in coastal areas like the Gulf of Maine, where there are sandy beaches half a mile away from steep granite cliffs. And what we found beginning our research is despite the broad variation in geomorphology and how tightly crenellated the coastline is, the basis for coastal access regulations is almost always based on political boundaries, so administrative boundaries, not ecological or hydrological ones. And further, Nicholas touched on this in the beginning, the colonial period truly shaped and still continues to shape how almost all countries around the world regulate coastal access, including countries far away from colonial powers. And so this background is important to understand because regulations that were created hundreds of years ago, particularly in the United Kingdom, which has very specific coastal conditions, were exported and continue to shape how different countries regulate their coasts, all of which have very different geomorphological conditions, economies, and also social practices around coastal access, as someone brought up in the chat. And in a broader view of the history of coastal access, one of the things that we found in the Western world is that the early use and regulation of the coast initially recognized these shifts in the coastline, recognized how a nor'easter or a hurricane can reshape the coast in a matter of hours. And coastal regulation was local, shaped by competing interests for recreation, sailing, fishing, shellfishing, fowling, trading, and shipbuilding. And this localized regulation and shared agreements around the coast, which were all done primarily through verbal communication, allowed different groups to adapt to changes from storms or from the pressures of waterfront development. All of this started to change on a very specific date around 1066 AD, when English common law was established during the medieval period. And coastal lands that were subject to title changes were transferred in the United Kingdom to the King of England. Coastal lands were seen as incapable of cultivation or private occupation, and therefore all of the title to submerged and coastal lands were vested in the sovereign king as trustee for the nation, which in many countries around the globe today has been exported and known, as we just discussed in the United States at least, as the public trust doctrine or a variant. This doctrine is directly tied to colonial notions of resource extraction and ownership, which have persisted to the modern day in common law jurisdictions across the world due to British imperialism, and has been developed by courts to provide a check and limitation on states and how they regulate coastal lands. And what we found is that this has really led to an ownership-based model for coastal public access in many places, which rely on the demarcation, so data collection and monitoring of public and private space, which often break down into disputes because of the dynamic nature of the coastline, and also because of the challenges of monitoring, mapping, and regulating a coastline that's shifting so frequently. An ownership-based model does not incentivize long-term sustainability, especially when long-term thinking around the coast conflicts with short-term profits. Today, despite the ocean being a global commons, there's no globally agreed on definition for public coastal access. And as Mike described, regulations are fragmented by individual municipalities, states, and countries, often based on their colonial history. And not only is there no shared definition, but there's also no shared agreement or definition for what even the concept of coastal access as a right, and so not as an ownership-based model may entail. So while the concept of global coastal access is generally defined as people's physical ability to view, reach, or move along the shoreline of the mainland and islands, we felt that there's room for a more nuanced or deeper perspective that takes into account how public coastal access might cater for the different uses, values, and roles that the coastline plays for different groups and communities, or really simply a recognition that different coastal users have different needs. And that all of these needs are associated with different values, from aesthetic, scientific, moralistic, or utilitarian values, meaning that public coastal access is necessarily and has to be a negotiation between multiple different people and stakeholders with competing values. In addition to the Western ownership-based model, which was really produced in the United Kingdom and then exported, there are a few other conceptual frameworks that have emerged to address coastal public access that I'll touch on briefly. The first is blue space planning, or planning for public space. Blue space planning developed in the 1980s, and the core idea of blue space planning is really representing aquatic environments as public spaces. And so the same way that we would think of a public park or a plaza as being a space that should be open and available to all, blue space planning treats the entire coastline as such. The critique of blue space planning is really privileging health over people's livelihoods. And so it represents a model that's applicable to post-industrial nations with developed infrastructure, but not subsistence-oriented patterns. And another framework that's much older is a rights-based framework that shifts away from issues of boundary demarcation and instead prioritizes just access to the coast, underpinned with a sense of reciprocal kinship and relationality to the land. based on principles of Indigenous stewardship around the world. And in order to understand how these competing frameworks are currently used, our group looked at different case studies from around the globe, and I'll share three of the six that we looked at kind of in brief. And it's critical to note just that these cases are not meant to be best practices. Rather, they illustrate critical issues and perspectives on coastal access, and hopefully they might provide lessons learned about the messy realities of how these frameworks, whether rights-based or ownership, which are really an academic construct, end up being messily lived in reality. And so the first, I was excited when Hannah mentioned the right to roam in the UK. One of the first case studies that we looked at was the United Kingdom, which maintains an ownership-based model with coastal areas being privately and publicly owned, though many areas are publicly accessible, given what is called the right to roam, which is basically the ability to pass through privately held lands. You can't extract from them, but you can walk across, for example, a field to be able to get to the coast. And maybe the best example of this is the English Coast Path, which is a 4,300-kilometer path along the English coastline, which is owned by Natural England, a UK government entity. And the idea of the English Coastal Path is to provide coastal access along the entire margin of the United Kingdom, and to link existing pathways that had developed in towns or villages with other pathways that had been developed by the state or by individual countries. And the path was originally expected to be opened in 2021. It is still not continuous or open to the public. But I think what we found really fascinating about the path, and this comes back to this question of monitoring and mapping the coast, is that the back end of establishing this path involved mapping coastal land at a very small scale, very fine-grained data resolution to be able to understand who are the land owners across the entire coast. And in the UK, there are areas where land ownership is not clearly demarcated. And so this was a lot of legal work to understand, in some cases going back hundreds of years, who are owners of land along the coast, and then to map future areas that might be susceptible to sea level rise and coastal erosion. And so the final product of the path is not only this recreational path that is meant to be open for people to enjoy, but also all of this back end data to help provide a blueprint for future climate adaptation area or action in areas that are more prone to coastal erosion, and also to set up a framework for monitoring the coast in the future. And so this really kind of creates a scalar framework for recreational access that builds upon hundreds of years of fragmented legislation to establish coastal access in a nation that uses an ownership-based framework. This ownership-based framework was exported across the globe due to British imperialism. And a case that we studied to understand this was Mauritius, which is a republic in the Indian Ocean. Mauritius gained independence in 1968, and it has been self-governing after being colonized by the Netherlands, followed by the French and the British. When Mauritius was decolonized in 1968, the country adopted what's called a Westminster parliamentary system, which is modeled again on the British system of governance, and it includes significant legal frameworks from the countries that had colonized the island, including France. The key piece of legislation here is called the Pas Géométrique Act, or the Not Geometric Act, and that makes land from the high tide mark to the horizon around the country publicly accessible, but it also grants the Mauritian government the ability to lease these lands to residents and commercial interests, as long as these interests do not limit public access below the high tide line. And what we found digging a little bit deeper is that in practice, this act is rarely followed. Hotels and residences frequently construct walls and barriers that prevent people from accessing the coast, and these issues are then exacerbated by sea level rise, which pushes the band of public coastal access space into private property without a clear legal process to mediate these disputes or a way to ensure that public access remains continuous across the coast. And so, in response, residents have since put forth proposals for what they call a coastal green belt that would allow access for fishers along the coast and would represent a departure from the colonial ownership-based model towards a rights-based framework as part of the ongoing process of Mauritius decolonization. And the last case I'll share is Australia, which follows both an ownership-based and an Indigenous rights-based framework. Australia is also unique, and this is worth noting, in having ambulatory coastal boundaries, which are dynamic property lines that move as the coast accretes or erodes. And I think something that's really important to acknowledge is the idea of ambulatory boundaries makes so much sense in a dynamic environment that is constantly changing. But again, in practice, these boundaries are still mapped and marked. And so the boundaries might be shifting, but they're only legal entities when they're recorded and mapped, which of course takes time and money to survey. And so the actual coastal boundaries very rarely reflect the coastline as it actually exists. And so, like Mauritius, the coastline is held in public trust, but through the Native Title Act of 1993, Aboriginal people in Australia can invoke inherited rights to the land, which includes access to the sea. These rights vary across jurisdictions without an overarching approach for the country. And so here, this is an example of both rights-based and ownership-based frameworks, both of which are contested across Australia, especially in the context of climate change and due to these variations across jurisdictions, whether state or city in Australia. But it is an approach that represents a limited example of combining a rights-based Indigenous framework with a colonial ownership-based framework that will continue to be tested in the future. And as I close out, I'd like to share the initial ambition that we had for this work when we started in 2021, which was to research and understand the policies that limit and enable public access in each country, and to share this in some type of interactive public map. And I think this really stemmed from our use of visualizations to share this work, to try to engage a broader audience, and then an interest in having a map that describes how variable and inconsistent coastal access policies are, even within the bounds of a single country, like in Australia. One of the key challenges that we found in studying coastal access truly revolves around scale, from local to global, where issues of coastal access at the scale of a port are very different than those facing urban metropolises. And also just kind of more pragmatically, issues around data availability and the completeness of monitoring and mapping data available, not to mention issues of translation to be able to compare different access policies that are written in hundreds of different languages. And so our intention with producing an interactive map was to be able to assemble additional resources, including design and policy resources that different countries are undertaking, which we started to investigate with these case studies, with the potentially naive idea that policy or initiatives that are currently being undertaken in one country or one context might be applicable to many other places. And so one of the guiding principles in this work, really as non-experts, was to amplify the work that's already being done, and to share it with a broader audience. I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but I would really welcome anyone who might be interested in continuing these questions or working to produce some type of comprehensive map or other visual tool, which I think the resource document in the chat is working to do. And I'll end by thanking again Nicholas and the conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to share this work. And I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk and for sharing the resource. I would love if you would also put that in the chat, certainly in the resource list. If you're just joining us, we are collecting resources from our audience today that have to do with coastal access. One of our tech volunteers, pardon me, will put that again in the chat for everyone just to refresh it. But what a really interesting study. And let me say, we're in the organizer chat going, wow, those graphics are so amazing. They're really effective and compelling in this, and I guess expressing some of your findings. So just amazing. I also was really taken by the high tide to the horizon as a framework for what is public. gosh, like just also a very compelling thought. So thank you again. I'll invite our audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask to Kara, please feel free to write those in our chat, or you can raise your hand and jump on your microphone. In the meantime, I guess I wonder if I could ask a little bit, like what brought you to the issue of coastal access originally, being that it is this somewhat niche topic still.
Totally. So I am a landscape architect, and one of the things that our profession is increasingly called to do are coastal adaptation projects. And almost always now, I would say the bulk of work that firms do is based on old seawalls or old infrastructure. And so one of the very first projects that I was working on was a seawall on the coast of Massachusetts that protects about 100 private properties. And now with sea level rise at a normal high tide, there's no public beach left. And so you have a seawall that really privileges these 100 families who bought cottages and bought houses in the 1800s and then leaves nothing for general public who are interested in going there. And I think it's so clear that that type of issue is only going to become more dire and more kind of prominent in the next 100 years. And so I think it's a really important thing to think about, not only professionally, but also personally.
That's yeah, I'm just hearing you say these things and go, us too, us too. It's exactly some of the challenges. Now, as someone who works in the architecture side of things, I wonder, and apologies if this is a bit outside your scope, but I wonder about your experience with working with people who are interested in trying to protect their private property, which makes sense. I think everyone wants to preserve their investment in their home, but that may be faced with a lack of options. And I'll just give the example that here in Nova Scotia, it is much easier to get a seawall built than any sort of, say, nature-based solution or living wall or anything, really anything else that isn't just this hard piece of infrastructure. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that.
No, that is an incredible kind of question. I think uh, I guess two things kind of come to mind. The first, I think so many nature-based solutions projects right now, you have the physical object that they'll produce. Someone will produce a living breakwater, or they'll produce um, a living shoreline that is a seawall that also has a marsh in front of it. And so you have the physical thing or the physical object that exists on the coast and it has all of these incredible benefits. But the real value in so many of these projects is actually the permitting processes that these firms or these companies go through, because it makes it that much easier for the next living breakwater or for the next nature-based solution to be able to get through a planning and permitting process. And that truly, I think, it all comes back to kind of policy processes that are not adapted and don't move at the same pace as coastal climate change is happening. And so they're in almost all projects, you have the physical outcome, and then you have kind of the background, which is that if you live in a municipality where a nature-based solution is constructed, if someone else then wants to build a nature-based solution, it'll take about half or a third as much of the time just because someone else has gone through the planning process. And I think there's so much value in that. There's also been a lot of work recently in design communities, and then also in terms of community engagement, of shifting away from thinking of design projects or architecture projects as building an object and instead toward designing scenarios. And so if you have an example of a barrier beach, there are three, as you just said, there are different solutions. You could restore that to a barrier beach system. You could rebuild a seawall, or you could begin a process of managed retreat. And we have the technical and design ability to do any of those things right now today. What we never have is the community support or agreement to actually do any of those things. And so there need to be ways to start conversations 15 to 20 years before you might have to make an adaptation choice in communities, build community support, and then agree on a path forward to be able to have a nature-based solution or something other than a seawall, which is really just what our legal systems are used to permitting. And this
Yeah.
maybe comes to Mike's question uh, in the chat of, are you finding that clients are becoming more receptive to adaptation that enables public access? Are you seeing more private or public conversations about access as anthropogenic climate change poses increased risks for natural coastal risks like erosion? Um, this is a really hard question. Um, and so I think one of the most kind of interesting findings uh, is that uh, in many places there's something that happens which is kind of paradoxical, which is that when places are designated as flood zones, or there are restrictions put upon coastal development. So if there's a law that is passed that says you can no longer develop the coastline in 2027, in 2026, you will see more coastal building than you have ever seen before. Uh, and so, in some ways, depending on your client, there are some clients that are very, very, very receptive to thinking about long-term solutions like adaptation land trusts or other ways to move from the coast. And at the same time, there's this rush of might be the last time that the getting is good. I want to make sure that my property, which in the US at least is really your only investment vehicle for the rest of your life, is protected. And so it's really hard to be able to balance those conversations, especially when working with private clients. But thank you for that question.
Wow, I'm just so struck by that, like the rapid increase that you might see. Bodhi has also put a question in the chat. They say that you mentioned in the Mauritius case that some landowners do build obstructions that impair coastal access, and a proposed solution is a designated protection zone. Could you comment on what role an increased coastal law enforcement might play in this solution to essentially protect whatever it is we designate in a green zone?
Cody, that is such a wonderful question. I think Mike is maybe the better person to answer this, but I will kind of give my best just from examples that we see in practice. Almost everything. Uh, and that I think really comes back to this question kind of time zones and the fact that you can have an area that's designated for coastal access. A storm can come in. We see this all the time in Massachusetts and places like Cape Cod or Nantucket, where you'll have coastal paths that are taken out in a day over the course of a storm. And then those paths may not be rebuilt, and also, private landowners may not then allow anyone to go on their land, even if it's just to kind of connect two disjointed parts of a path. And so, to ensure the green zone is maintained is really an effort that I think has to include not only the adjacent landowners, but then also a national authority to be able to ensure that efforts like that aren't just constructed, but they're actually maintained and stewarded.
Yeah, and being able to detect that change, I feel, can also be such a bit of a confounding factor if you're already losing the access to get there to observe it. Mike, I think, pointed this out nicely at the beginning of his, but yeah, gosh, what a challenging issue. I'm just looking in the chat. I don't see any more immediate questions. Patricia comments that rapid development in advance of some sort of restriction is a common phenomenon. Unfortunate. So maybe I'll ask just one last question before we wrap up this session. I guess for you and your team, what are some of the next steps in your work?
I think one of the real challenges in this is also maybe accelerating based on the political situation in the US. One of the biggest challenges that we found is just the unevenness in data availability. And so in some countries, you will have coastal mapping or satellite imagery that is down to 1 meter resolution, and you can understand where the coastline is, how it's changing, what are rates of erosion. And then in other places, you have 30-meter imagery where you're basically guessing kind of where lines are demarcated. And so there's such data inequity. And I think one of the common themes in these two presentations is really the ability to monitor really depends on the amount of data and the resolution of data that you have available. Um, and so something that I think we would love to keep working on are just compiling different data sets or different maps that actually show the different countries and the types of policies that they use, and then also data that exists and is available to be able to map and track coastal access around the world.
Gosh, well, I mean that what a no better segue could be asked for some of our talks later today. So you've clairvoyantly predicted the rest of our program. We'll be hearing actually quite a bit about mapping projects and trying to do some of that forecasting later. So thank you so very much, Kara, for joining us today and for your talk. It's extremely interesting. Thank you for your inspiring graphics. This makes me wish to be a better graphic designer myself.